Greetings once again, friends, and welcome to another installment of the Difficult Scriptures Finally Explained. I think it is time that once and for all we finally explain Genesis chapter 7 verse 4, which talks about the flood. Genesis chapter 7 verse 4, it says, "For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will destroy from off the face of the ground." Now many people doubt the extent of the flood. They have wondered about whether the biblical flood was only a local flood or a worldwide event. However, the Bible writers undoubtedly describe the flood as universal in extent and effect. Most geologists reject the historicity of such a flood, and this has therefore become one of the chief points of conflict between Christianity and the modern evolutionary philosophy. Some Christian writers have tried to promote the compromise view that the flood was only a great river overflow on the Euphrates or some other river in the Middle East. However, friends, the Bible and the biblical case for a global deluge is quite convincing. The following are just a few of the many reasons for this position. Here is one reason. More than 30 statements of the universal characters, that is, of the flood and its effects occur in Genesis chapter 6 through Genesis chapter 9. So Genesis 6 through 9, we have more than 30 statements of the universal character of the flood and its effects. The second reason, the purpose of the flood was to destroy not only all mankind, but also all animal life on the dry land as well. We read about that in Genesis chapter 6, verse 7 and 16, and in chapter 7, verse 22. Another reason, the flood was even sent to destroy the earth. That's what it says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 13. The flood also covered all the mountains, Genesis chapter 7, verse 19 and 20. The flood lasted over a year, Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, and chapter 8, verse 13. The ark had a volumetric capacity of more than 500 standard railroad stock cars, which is far more than adequate to hold 2 of every known species, past or present, of dry land animals. The ark was ridiculously unnecessary for Noah, the animals, and especially the birds, to escape from a mere local flood. God also promised in Genesis chapter 8, verse 21, and in chapter 9, verses 11 and 15, God promised never again to send such a flood, and that promise has been repeatedly broken if it were not only a local flood. So that promise would have been broken if that was a local flood. Another reason, all men in the world today are said to have descended from Noah's three sons. We know that from Genesis chapter 9, verse 1 and verse 19. Also, another reason is that many later biblical writers accepted the historicity of the worldwide flood. If you note such accounts, you'll see them in Job chapter 12, verse 15, and chapter 22, verse 16, Psalms 29, verse 10, and 104, verses 6 through 9. The book of Isaiah 44, chapter 44, verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. And Hebrews 11, chapter 7. Also, Jesus Christ believed in the universal flood and took it as the type of the coming destruction of the world when he returns. We read his words in Matthew chapter 24, verse 37 through 39, and in Luke chapter 17, verses 26 and 27. So the above and other biblical proofs that could be added if necessary prove that not only the author of the book of Genesis, but the other biblical authors as well, and even Jesus Christ himself, accepted the flood as a worldwide extent and effect. Now, to this evidence could be added the well-known fact that practically all nations and tribes in the world have retained some kind of tradition of the flood at the dawn of their history. The fact that most modern geologists reject these evidences stems from the philosophy of uniformitarianism and evolutionism that has formed the backbone of geological interpretations for the past century. Now, the uniformity principle, popularized originally by Hutton and Lyell, a medicinal man and a lawyer respectively, claims that all of Earth's past history should be explained in terms of ordinary natural processes as they occur today. Now, the evolutionary philosophy popularized by Charles Darwin, an apostate divinity student turned naturalist, says that the origin of all the forms of life and of life itself must likewise be explained in terms of present natural processes. Now, these two philosophies are at the foundation of the evolutionary interpretation of the Earth's supposed geological ages, and they obviously preclude the biblical record of special creation and the flood. Thus, the fossils of former living plants and animals, as found in the sedimentary rocks of the Earth's crust, are used to date the rocks and to determine the particular geological age of the formation containing them. This is done primarily on the assumption that rocks containing simple fossils must be older, and those containing complex fossils must be younger, since all things have developed by a process of evolution over the ages. But then, these geological ages and their fossil records supposedly provide the best, indeed the only, historical proof of the fact under quotation mark, of evolution over the ages. Now, this is a notorious case of the flagrant circular reasoning that is frequently used for evidence in modern scientific philosophy. It is significant that before the time of Lyell and Darwin and their followers and popularizers, Marx, Spencer, Huxley, Nietzsche, etc., the dominant theory of geology for the preceding century, that of the Great Awakening in science, had been the flood theory, which understood the sedimentary rocks and their fossil contents as having been originally deposited as sediments during the awful year of the Great Flood and the century or so following. This explanation of the geologic strata was never disproved. It was simply rejected, and as a result, we have evolution. So the explanation of geologic strata was never disproved. It was simply rejected as inconsistent with the philosophies of progress and humanism and evolutionary socialism that came into vogue in the 19th century. Actually, there is much evidence that most of the strata must have been deposited rapidly, not gradually. Otherwise, for example, how could their fossil contents have been preserved? Furthermore, instead of a universal principle of evolutionary progress in the world, the second law of thermodynamics combines with all actual human experience to indicate rather that there prevails a universal law of decay and deterioration in the world. Although creationism and catastrophism, as opposed to evolutionary uniformitarianism, does represent a minority view in science, it is an increasingly recognized view. There is not only overwhelming biblical testimony, but also adequate supporting scientific data to warrant acceptance of the Noahic flood.